Before we dive in, imagine this. A senior flight attendant denies a simple glass of water to a quiet man in first class. But what she doesn't know is who he really is. By the time the plane lands, her entire career is over, and he never even raised his voice. You're not going to want to miss how this unfolds. Before we begin, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you tuning in from? Drop a comment. We'd love to hear from you. There was something about the way he walked through the terminal that made people take a second look, even if they didn't know why. Maybe it was the way he held himself, not with arrogance, but like someone who never needed to explain where he was going or why he belonged there. Darius Langford didn't dress like most first-class passengers. No designer logos, no overdone luggage, just a charcoal blazer, a dark button-down, and a calmness in his step that came from years of learning how to carry quiet power. His wife, Celine, walked beside him in a cream-colored coat, simple gold earrings, and a grace that didn't demand attention. It invited it. Their two kids, Malik and Kaya, moved without fuss behind them, each pulling a compact silver suitcase and sharing a kind of unspoken rhythm that only close-knit families seem to have. They made their way toward Gate C-42 at JFK. The signs above flickered with destination updates, and the familiar crackle of the intercom gave boarding instructions that no one really listened to. TSA lines moved like honey on a cold day, and people bumped shoulders without saying, "Excuse me." But even in all that chaos, the Langfords moved through like water flowing around stones. A gate agent barely glanced up from her screen when they handed over their boarding passes. "Enjoy your flight," she mumbled, not bothering to smile. Darius nodded. Celine offered a polite "thank you," and the family continued toward the jet bridge. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin smelled faintly of new leather and citrus, the kind of scent that tried to tell you, you've made it. Soft lighting bounced off brushed metal fixtures. The seats were wide, cushioned, designed for silence. There were no babies crying here, no elbows fighting for space. Darius took seat 1A by the window. Celine sat beside him in 1B. Across the aisle, Kaya and Malik settled into 1C and 1D. The kids didn't pull out devices right away or talk over one another. They simply sat back, taking in the cabin like they'd seen it 100 times before. And they had. This wasn't new to them. A flight attendant passed by, blonde, mid-40s, crisp uniform with not a strand of hair out of place. Her name tag read, Miranda Huxley. Her expression didn't shift when she looked at the family, but her eyes did. Just a flicker of something too practiced to be natural. She gave a quick nod, the kind that said, "I see you," but not "I see you." She continued down the aisle without saying a word. Darius looked straight ahead, one hand resting loosely on the armrest. His phone sat on airplane mode in his lap. He didn't type. He didn't scroll. He just sat, present in a way that made other people feel like they were the ones who'd forgotten something. Celine glanced sideways at him, then turned to Kaya across the aisle. "You okay, sweet girl?" Kaya smiled, small and certain. "Yeah, I just like when it's quiet like this." Malik nodded, adjusting his hoodie. "Feels like everyone's pretending to be important." Celine chuckled softly. "That's just business class energy, baby." They didn't laugh loud. The Langfords never needed volume to take up space. That wasn't how they'd been raised. Miranda returned a few minutes later, greeting a man in 2A with a bright smile. He wore a navy suit and carried a briefcase that practically shouted hedge fund. "Good morning, sir. Would you like a beverage while we finish boarding?" "Sparkling water, please." "Of course," she returned promptly with a glass bottle, chilled, and a napkin folded just so. Kaya watched the exchange and looked toward her mom. "Can I get some water too?" Celine gave her daughter a soft pat on the hand. "You can ask." Kaya leaned across the aisle slightly, voice gentle. "Excuse me, ma'am? Could I please have some water?" Miranda didn't break stride. "We'll serve drinks after takeoff," she said flatly and kept walking. Kaya blinked, eyebrows pulling in just a little. Celine offered a quiet smile. "That's okay. We'll wait." Darius didn't react. Not with a word. Not even a glance. But his fingers tapped once on the side of his phone, then stopped. Malik shifted in his seat, not quite sure what he just witnessed. Not enough to be rude, but not right either. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. Boarding continued. Luggage clicked into overhead bins. Window shades opened and closed. That quiet rhythm of pre-flight moved around them, but the Langfords, especially Darius, stayed still. Not frozen, just measured. He closed his eyes for a moment, drawing in a breath that didn't need to be deep. And if anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly. But no one did, at least not yet. As the plane rolled back from the gate, Miranda moved through the first-class cabin with a kind of mechanical precision. Her steps were quick, her uniform smooth, and her face held that flight attendant expression, pleasant but unreadable. She checked seat belts, adjusted headrests, and offered quick nods that didn't invite conversation. When she passed row 1 again, her eyes brushed over Darius and his family. She didn't pause, didn't speak, just kept moving. Darius didn't flinch. Neither did Celine. But Malik, his eyes followed her. Kaya sat back quietly, hands resting on her lap, still thinking about that no she'd gotten. It hadn't been rude, not really, but it also hadn't been human. Not the way the man behind them had been treated. The wheels lifted from the ground, and the plane eased into the sky with that familiar hum that settled into your chest. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Some passengers reached for books, others for earbuds. And Kaya, she pressed the call button. It didn't take long before Miranda reappeared. Yes? Her voice was clipped, polite on the surface, but missing something underneath. Celine spoke this time. Calm, clear. It's a bit warm up here. Could my children have a small bottle of water, please? Miranda leaned in, lowering her voice. As I mentioned before, we'll be serving drinks shortly. I'll have to ask for your patience. Her tone didn't rise. Her words didn't bite. But something in the way she said it left no room for warmth. Celine offered a polite nod. Of course. Miranda straightened and turned away. Darius opened his eyes, said nothing. Just picked up his phone and typed a brief message, one that took only a few seconds. Then he laid it face down on the armrest again. The hum of the engines filled the silence between them. Not awkward silence, not angry, just still. Meanwhile, further down the aisle, a man in 2C was being served a drink with a slice of lemon on the rim. Miranda handed it to him with a small laugh, as if they'd shared some inside joke. Nina Chen, a younger flight attendant with soft eyes and a more genuine smile, watched the exchange. She turned slightly toward Miranda and said under her breath, "You want me to handle the second row?" Miranda shook her head without turning. "No, I've got it." She continued down the line, offering drinks with just enough charm to pass. But when she reached 1C and 1D again, Malik and Kaya, she paused for the briefest moment, then moved on. Kaya glanced after her. "I thought she said she'd come back." Malik didn't answer, his lips pressed together. Darius noticed, of course. He noticed everything. But he stayed where he was, arms resting lightly on the armrest, watching his own reflection in the window. Nina leaned over to Miranda at the galley. "Did you mean to skip that row?" "They didn't ask again," Miranda replied, pouring another glass of sparkling water. "They're just kids," Nina said softly. Miranda didn't look up. "They're not kids, and they can wait." Back in 1A, Celine leaned slightly toward her husband. "That's the third time," she murmured. "They're watching," he replied quietly. Darius picked up his phone again and tapped another message. His face remained composed, but something had shifted. Not anger, not even frustration, just awareness. In the cockpit, a small notification blinked on the captain's dashboard. The co-pilot leaned in, reading the screen carefully. "Sir," he said, looking at the captain, "we just got an alert. Flagged passenger in 1A. It's coming from King Aviation Holdings." The captain sat up straighter. "What kind of flag?" "Executive protocol. Founder on board." The captain exhaled slowly, then stood and adjusted his uniform. A few moments later, he walked out into the first-class cabin. No announcement, no disruption. Just a quiet, purposeful step down the aisle. Several passengers looked up. Miranda saw him and straightened immediately. But he didn't speak to her. He stopped in front of 1A, looked at Darius and said, "Sir, is everything all right?" Darius looked up, voice steady. Not yet, but it will be. The captain gave a small nod and turned back toward the cockpit without another word. Miranda stood frozen near the galley. Her smile had vanished. She looked at Nina. What's going on? Nina shook her head slowly. I think you should check the system. Miranda stepped aside, opened her crew tablet, and scanned quickly through the internal feed. There it was, a red tag on seat 1A. Status, VIP. Origin, Executive Ethics Office. Her throat tightened. Back at 1A, Celine adjusted Kaya's blanket, calm as ever. Malik pulled out a book and flipped it open. Darius placed his phone face down again and leaned back in his seat, eyes half closed. Sometimes silence does the loudest talking. Miranda returned to the galley, hands slightly trembling. She picked up the intercom phone and dialed into the cockpit. Captain, is there something I should be aware of? A long pause. Then the captain's voice came through, calm and cold. Yes, Ms. Huxley, you'll be informed shortly. Click. Miranda stood there, phone still in her hand. The galley felt colder than before. She turned and Nina was watching her. Not smugly, not unkindly, just watching. The silence between them said more than any conversation could. Miranda stood in the narrow galley, trying to swallow the sudden dryness in her throat. The metal surfaces around her, normally polished and familiar, felt sterile, almost hostile. The hum of the engines, usually a comforting background noise, now buzzed louder in her ears. She placed the handset back in its holder with forced care, like one wrong move might set something off. Nina was still nearby, her hands busy organizing snack trays, but her eyes drifted back to Miranda every few seconds. There was no accusation in them, just an unease, a kind of quiet question hanging in the air that Miranda didn't feel ready to answer. From the back of the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted, not dramatically, not with chaos or shouting, but with a slow, steady pull. Passengers began whispering, not the usual idle chit-chat, but the kind that came with glances and slight nods in the direction of row 1. Kaya was now curled up with her blanket, earbuds in. Malik was sketching something in a small notebook, tapping his pencil in that mindless rhythm kids fall into when they're thinking too hard. Celine was reading from a tablet, face relaxed, unbothered. Darius sat with one hand on his lap and the other resting gently on his phone. He hadn't touched it again. He didn't need to. Miranda took a deep breath and stepped out into the aisle. She walked down past 2A and 2C, checking tray tables that didn't need checking. When she reached row 1 again, she slowed but didn't stop. Kaya looked up from her blanket. Excuse me, she said again, quieter this time. Could I have some water now? Miranda didn't make eye contact. I'll come back to you, she said curtly, already stepping past. She didn't come back. Nina, now standing a few rows behind, watched it happen. Her chest tightened. She looked at Miranda, then toward the front of the cabin. She saw Darius glance at his daughter, then back to the window. There was something painful about that stillness, like watching someone bleed slowly and silently, while everyone pretended not to notice. Back at the galley, Miranda began stacking napkins that were already neat. She could feel Nina's presence even before she heard her voice. Miranda, Nina said quietly, they're just kids. Miranda didn't look up. It's not about that. Nina raised an eyebrow. Then what is it about? They're not entitled to special treatment, Miranda muttered. They can wait like everyone else. Nina said nothing, but the silence between them wasn't neutral. It was thick with something Miranda didn't want to name. Suddenly, the crew tablet near the jump seat buzzed with a soft alert. Miranda grabbed it without thinking, then stared at the notification. Flight ethics flag acknowledged. Subject under passive review. Underneath a short line. Continue standard service. Observation in progress. Her hands gripped the edges of the tablet. She could feel the pressure behind her eyes, that telltale sign of a headache creeping in. She turned around slowly, scanning the cabin again. No one was looking at her directly, but everyone felt further away. A second alert came through, this time on the backup unit. Directive pending. Stand by for instruction from Flight Ops Executive. Miranda's stomach dropped. Nina was now watching her more closely, concern growing. Are you okay? I'm fine, Miranda said sharply, then immediately regretted it. She softened her voice. I just need a second. She stepped aside back into the crew space and leaned against the wall. She pressed her fingertips to her temples. Everything felt too loud, too close. How had this gone sideways so fast? It wasn't like she'd yelled at anyone. She didn't say anything offensive. She was just doing her job, following protocol. But somewhere deep down, where honesty lived in corners she didn't usually clean, she felt it. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. Or worse, how she didn't say anything at all. She looked at them and made a quiet judgment. She hadn't even realized she was doing it. She didn't think they'd be relevant, certainly not the kind of passengers who triggered flags from the executive floor. And now everything was shifting. She wasn't in control anymore. Farther up the cabin, Darius hadn't moved. Celine reached over and took his hand, squeezing it gently. He squeezed back. Are you all right? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm watching, he said. Celine nodded. They're watching you too now. A beat passed. Darius leaned his head slightly, almost imperceptibly. That's fine. Let them. Nina walked up the aisle, pausing beside Kaya and Malik. She knelt slightly, offering them each a small bottle of water and a smile that didn't need to be forced. Sorry for the wait, she said softly. Kaya looked surprised, then grateful. Malik gave a polite nod. Thanks. Nina continued on, but her glance lingered for a moment on Miranda in the galley. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Miranda stood motionless in the galley, her fingers brushing against a row of sealed napkins as if organizing them would somehow help her organize her thoughts. But they wouldn't line up the way she wanted them to. Nothing did anymore. The tablet buzzed again, just a soft pulse in her palm. But this time, the message was different. Subject Huxley, prepare for temporary removal from active cabin service. Await directive. That was not normal. She stared at the words, her breath shallow. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. A tightness formed just behind her ribs, growing with every heartbeat. This was the kind of notification they only use for misconduct, emergencies, incidents that involve passenger threats, not water, not her. At least that's what she told herself. Nina returned from the aisle, pausing just outside Miranda's line of sight. You okay? She asked again, this time gentler. Miranda forced a nod. Fine. But her voice cracked on the edges. Nina noticed. She always did. I'll handle mid-cabin for now, Nina offered, sensing the shift in the air, even if she didn't know what it meant yet. Miranda didn't argue. Back in 1A, Darius remained still, his body calm, his face unreadable, but his presence unmistakable. Celine turned toward him, her voice soft. Do you think they've figured it out yet? I'm not hiding, he said. They'll figure out what they need to. Malik closed his sketchbook and looked toward his father. Is this going to get messy? Darius looked at his son and gave the kind of answer you give when the truth is bigger than the question. Sometimes things don't need to be loud to be clear. Kaya leaned her head against the window, eyes scanning the clouds. I don't think she likes us, she murmured. Celine's voice came with the warmth of steady waters. She doesn't know you, that's all. But deep down, they all knew that wasn't really it. The silence in the cabin was no longer just quiet. It was tight, watchful, like the air before a summer storm. Everyone could feel something building, even if they couldn't name it. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, another light blinked on. The co-pilot looked at the alert, then turned to the captain. Directive just came through. We're greenlit to proceed with internal repositioning. The captain didn't hesitate. Go ahead. 3 minutes later, the cabin intercom buzzed, not the usual passenger update, but a short ping, internal crew channel only. Miranda's tablet lit up once more. Effective immediately, step down from service, move to rear jump seat, operational debrief pending upon landing. She read the message once, then again. Her hands went cold. She had to steady herself against the cart. Nina looked over, brows drawn. What is it? Miranda swallowed hard. They're pulling me from service. Nina blinked. Mid-flight? Miranda nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. Mid-flight, she stepped back from the galley as if the walls had narrowed around her. Her arms felt too long for her sleeves, her name tag too heavy for her chest. As she walked past the first-class rows, no tray, no smile, no role to perform, passengers turned slightly, just enough to notice. Some glanced at each other, others pretended not to see. Kaya peeked up. Malik sat straighter. Celine raised her eyes just long enough to meet Miranda's. But there was no anger there, no satisfaction, just a question that Miranda couldn't answer. She kept walking, head high, but her hands trembled at her sides. At the back of the plane, a junior flight attendant named Farah stood near the jump seat, adjusting coffee filters. She turned when Miranda approached, confusion in her eyes. "Everything okay?" Farah asked, already sensing it wasn't. Miranda didn't answer right away. She just pulled down the jump seat and sat, her spine stiff, eyes unfocused. Farah looked toward the front, then back at Miranda. "You want some water?" Miranda let out a shaky breath, one that sounded too much like a laugh. "Sure." Farah handed her a bottle. Miranda stared at it for a moment, then held it in her lap without opening it. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent the last hour deciding who was worthy of water. Now, sitting in the very place she once sent others for doing less, she couldn't even bring herself to take a sip. Behind her, the cabin moved on. Nina served coffee, checked belts, answered quiet questions. But in row 1, things had changed. Passengers leaned toward one another, whispering what they'd seen. Some already knew who Darius was. A few pulled out their phones to confirm it. A couple nodded in understanding. Others just watched, trying to put the pieces together. Darius remained where he was, still and steady. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He didn't move. He didn't need to. And that, more than anything, was what Miranda couldn't shake. She hadn't just lost control of the cabin. She'd lost control of the narrative, and everyone could see it. Farah left Miranda alone at the rear jump seat, the hum of the engines filling the quiet between them. The cold leather beneath Miranda's legs was nothing compared to the hollow ache beginning to settle in her chest. She sat still, staring at the unopened bottle of water like it was some kind of riddle she couldn't solve. Up front, the cabin moved on without her. Nina, now leading service, had slipped into the role with quiet grace. She wasn't overly friendly, not showy, but kind in a way that made passengers feel seen. As she passed 1A with a tray of tea and warm towels, she paused just slightly. "Would you care for anything else, sir?" she asked Darius. He looked up. Not cold, not distant, just present. "No, thank you," he said. Nina nodded, then offered Celine and the kids a brief, respectful glance. "Let me know if you change your mind." Celine returned the nod. Malik tucked his blanket tighter around his lap. Kaya was watching something on her tablet, but every few minutes her eyes drifted back to where Miranda had been. Something about the way that woman walked away had stuck with her. In the rear cabin, Miranda finally shifted, uncapping the water bottle with a twist that echoed louder than it should have. She took a sip. It tasted the same as always, but it didn't feel the same. Nothing did. She picked up the crew tablet again, desperate for clarity. Maybe a message. Maybe someone had called in to clear this up. Instead, another alert popped up. Incident escalated. Flagged by King Aviation Holdings. Flight 2087 under review. Passenger 1A confirmed as Darius Langford. Founder-level protocol engaged. Miranda's breath caught. Her throat closed slightly. She had heard the name, of course. Everyone at Altair had. Darius Langford wasn't a CEO who plastered himself on newsletters or flew around in branded jets. He didn't give flashy interviews or pose with celebrities. He built the company, quietly, deliberately, and he stayed out of the spotlight, on purpose, until now. Miranda scrolled to confirm it again, hoping she'd misread. But there it was, verified. The man she'd dismissed, the family she'd brushed past. They weren't just important. They were the foundation. Suddenly, all the small choices she'd made, each slight, each excuse disguised as policy, snapped into focus like a line of dominoes she'd pretended not to see. Farah returned to check inventory. When she saw the look on Miranda's face, she hesitated. "Everything all right?" Miranda didn't answer. She just nodded slowly, as if the gesture could somehow undo everything she now knew. Back in first class, Nina finished the round and returned to the galley. The atmosphere felt different now. The kind of calm that comes after a realization has passed from one row to another. It wasn't just about water anymore. It wasn't even about Miranda. It was about what people saw and what they chose to ignore. Nina tapped the intercom to the cockpit. "Captain, do you need anything from the cabin?" The captain replied after a pause, his voice low. "Maintain course, and tell Langford he'll be briefed directly upon arrival." "Understood," Nina replied. She looked toward row 1 again. The family was talking quietly now. Kaya had leaned over to whisper something to Celine, and Celine smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. Malik had pulled out his sketchbook again. From where Nina stood, she could just make out the lines of a figure sitting in a jump seat at the back of the plane. A woman, alone. In 1A, Darius reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, an old boarding pass from a flight taken years ago. He smoothed it out slowly, tracing the edges with his thumb. Celine noticed. "You kept that one?" she asked. He nodded. "That was the day they asked if I was in the wrong seat. First time I flew on this route." Celine tilted her head. "You didn't say anything back then." "I didn't need to," he said quietly. "I was building something they'd eventually fly in." She didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. The cabin fell into a hush again, but this time it was different. Not cold, not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came when people started paying attention. And somewhere in that quiet, Miranda realized. This wasn't just a bad day. This was a reckoning. The wheels were still high above the clouds, but down in the cabin, the ground had already begun to shift. Miranda sat stiffly at the back of the aircraft, the bottle of water now half empty in her lap, her eyes unfocused. She wasn't watching the passengers anymore. She wasn't watching anything, just listening to the muted clicks of the service carts, the occasional seatbelt buckle, the low hum of voices passing between rows. Every sound felt like it was happening far away, muffled by the pressure in her chest. Her tablet buzzed again. She didn't want to look, but she did. Flight Ops Executive Review logged. Subject fields, Miranda Huxley. Preliminary observation complete. Ground debrief to follow upon arrival. Access badge to be surrendered at gate. The words didn't shock her. Not anymore. But reading them felt like dropping through a floor she hadn't realized was hollow. Farah returned again, this time a little slower. She glanced down at Miranda's lap, noticed the tablet screen still open. She saw the words, the notice. She didn't comment. Instead, she gently reached for a packet of tissues and placed it next to the bottle of water without saying a word. Miranda didn't cry. Not yet. But the kindness of that gesture landed harder than she expected. She nodded once. "Thanks," she murmured. Farah simply nodded back and stepped away. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow. Outside, the light was changing. Less blue, more amber. That part of the flight where you knew the descent wasn't far off, even if no one had announced it yet. And still no one had spoken her name. No one had raised their voice. No one had cursed her out or made a scene. Darius Langford hadn't needed to. Nina walked quietly through the cabin, collecting empty glasses, checking on passengers. When she passed 1A, she paused just slightly. Darius looked up at her, not with expectation, not with pride, just calm awareness. She lowered her voice. "Everything all right, sir?" He gave a slight nod. "Yes." "Thank you." Nina turned to go, but Darius spoke again, not loud, just enough. "You've handled this with grace." Nina's face softened, just a bit. "I just did what was right." "That's harder than it sounds," he said. She didn't reply. She just nodded and moved on. Celine glanced toward her husband. "You could have spoken up hours ago." Darius looked ahead. "And said what?" "That I deserve something? That I built the seat I'm sitting in? That she should know who I am?" He paused. "She wasn't wrong because of who I am. She was wrong because of how she treated us when she didn't know." Celine reached over, brushing his hand with hers. "And now?" Darius let out a slow breath. "Now I want her to sit in it, to feel the shape of what she thought was nothing." Kaya glanced up from her movie. She'd taken off one earbud and was watching her parents quietly. Malik closed his sketchbook again, then leaned over toward his sister. "She's not coming back, huh?" he asked. Kaya shook her head. "Number, I don't think so." They weren't sad about it. They weren't mad either. Just done. The people sitting nearby had grown more alert. Passengers who once avoided eye contact now watched Miranda's absence like it was part of the in-flight entertainment. Some whispered, others sent texts. One man nudged his wife and pointed. Subtle, but not enough to hide the curiosity in his face. And then the curtain near the front parted. The co-pilot stepped into the cabin, holding a folded envelope. He made his way to the rear, avoiding direct eye contact. He reached the galley, saw Miranda sitting, and paused. Her eyes lifted slowly. He extended the envelope. "From Flight Operations." "It's official now." Miranda took it, hands barely steady enough to open the seal. Inside, a typed notice. "Suspension pending executive review. Immediate removal from in-flight duty. Termination under consideration. HR debrief scheduled upon landing." A final line stood out in bold. "Badge access will be revoked. Uniform surrender required." Miranda didn't speak. She couldn't. Her eyes didn't move from the page, but her ears caught the familiar voice of Nina back at the front, announcing, "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please make sure your seat backs and tray tables are in their upright position." Miranda leaned back in the jump seat, letting the announcement fade into background noise. She stared at the paper in her hands. All the years she'd put in, all the checklists she'd memorized, the seniority, the respect, the pride she took in running a tight cabin. It was all there, in her mind. And now it was gone. Not because of a fight, not because of some massive failure, because she'd dismissed a family for no reason at all. And now that moment, so small, so ordinary, was the one that would define her. Behind the curtain, the world was still flying, but Miranda had already landed. The aircraft tilted gently, nose angling toward its descent. That subtle drop in altitude, barely felt by most, landed differently in Miranda's chest. It wasn't motion sickness. It was the kind of nausea that came when you knew something was ending, but you couldn't stop it or slow it down. From her jump seat in the back, she watched the cabin like it wasn't hers anymore. Not her aisle, not her tray cart, not her name on the manifest. She was still in uniform, still wearing her wings, but every part of her felt like a ghost, haunting a space that had already moved on. The passengers didn't look at her, not directly, but she saw the glances, the way people shifted when she passed by, the way their voices dropped, the way Nina avoided saying anything more than necessary. Even Farah, so kind and soft-spoken, had stopped asking if she was okay, and she couldn't blame them, because in their eyes now, she wasn't senior crew or lead on shift. She was the one who ignored the kids, the one who dismissed their mother, the one who hadn't brought water to a man who turned out to own the very plane she stood in. Miranda's grip tightened on the edge of her seat. Her fingers curled until her knuckles turned pale. Back in row 1, Darius remained motionless, as if the descent had no effect on him. He glanced briefly at the window, then toward his children. Kaya had fallen asleep, her head resting on Celine's shoulder. Malik was awake, but quiet, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of his seat. Celine looked down at Kaya, smoothing her daughter's hair away from her forehead. She didn't speak, just offered a touch, gentle, constant, grounding. Darius turned to her. "Do you remember that time in Houston?" he asked, his voice low. Celine nodded without looking up. "The restaurant. They made us wait outside, even though we had a reservation." Celine's hand stilled. "Because we didn't look right." He gave a small nod. "I never forgot that." "Neither did I," she replied. A pause passed between them, not bitter, not even angry, just heavy. "This is different," Darius said. Celine finally looked at him. "Is it?" He nodded. "This time they don't get to walk away without feeling it." Malik glanced over. "She still doesn't know who you are, does she?" "Oh, she knows," Darius said. "She just doesn't know what that means yet." From her seat at the back, Miranda stared at her hands. They didn't feel like her hands. She kept waiting for the adrenaline to settle, but it hadn't. She was still in fight or flight mode, except there was no fight left, and nowhere to flee. She looked down at her name tag. Huxley, a name she'd worn for years with pride. Suddenly it felt heavy, not because it was wrong, but because it no longer meant anything. She reached up slowly and unclipped it. She didn't even realize she was doing it at first. It was reflexive, like taking off earrings at the end of the day. Except this wasn't the end of the day. This was the end of something else entirely. Farah returned quietly, double-checking inventory for landing. She paused when she saw Miranda without her name tag. "You okay?" she asked one last time. Miranda didn't answer right away. Then, barely above a whisper, "I don't know." Farah nodded, her voice soft. "Let me know if you need anything." Miranda almost laughed. That phrase, so ordinary, so expected. "Let me know if you need anything." It was what flight attendants said to make passengers feel like they mattered. Except now she didn't know how to ask for anything, even help. From the cockpit, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our final approach into San Francisco. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and all items are stowed." Miranda had said those words herself hundreds of times, thousands. But this time, they didn't feel like instructions. They felt like closure. As the plane dipped slightly and the cabin grew quiet, Darius reached down and retrieved a leather folder from beneath his seat. He handed it to Celine. She opened it, eyes scanning the contents. "The formal report?" she asked. Darius nodded, with the statement attached. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. Back in the galley, Miranda placed her name tag in her lap, along with the envelope from Flight Ops. She looked at them both for a long time, like pieces from two separate puzzles she no longer knew how to solve. She wanted to justify it, to tell herself she hadn't meant harm, that it was just timing, just routine, just a bad moment. But every time she reached for that excuse, she saw Kaya's face again. Not angry, not hurt, just surprised and tired. And that stayed with her more than anything. Outside the window, the airport came into view, runways stretching like gray rivers, lights blinking in steady rhythm. Miranda knew what was waiting for her past the gate. A quiet escort, a formal meeting, maybe a box to place her wings in. Maybe someone would offer her coffee out of pity, or maybe nothing at all. For the first time in her career, she wouldn't be the one welcoming people back on the return leg. She wouldn't be the one in charge of the cabin. She wouldn't even be a name on the log. She'd just be the woman who made a decision, one that seemed small in the moment, but spoke volumes louder than anything she ever said out loud. And now that decision had its own seat, right next to hers, empty, waiting, and unforgettable. The plane dipped lower through a thick bank of clouds, the sky outside dulling into shades of gray and amber. Lights on the ground flickered into view, highways, rooftops, long lines of cars that looked like matchsticks from above. The final stretch. For most people, it signaled a return home. But for Miranda, it felt like stepping off a ledge into something she couldn't name. She sat motionless, hands folded over her lap, the official envelope now tucked into the seat pocket in front of her, like a souvenir she didn't ask for. Her name tag sat beside it. She hadn't put it back on. It didn't feel like it belonged to her anymore. Nina came to the back galley briefly to secure loose items before landing. She didn't say anything at first, just moved with the silent professionalism that Miranda used to pride herself on. There was no judgment in her eyes, just distance. That stung more than anger ever could. Miranda shifted, trying to ease the tightness in her lower back. The jump seat wasn't made for reflection, but that's all it offered her now. That and time. Too much time to think about what she'd done. She'd been in this uniform for 13 years, had flown through snowstorms, medical emergencies, even an unexpected water landing once in Colorado. She'd broken up fights, calmed down panic attacks, walked newly widowed spouses to their connections. She had done good work, but none of that mattered right now. Not to the people on this plane, not to the people reviewing her conduct from a glass office above an arrival's gate. And, truthfully, not even to herself. Because somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing passengers as people. Not all of them, just the ones who didn't look like the ones who complained, who wrote Yelp reviews, who threatened to call corporate, and that quiet family in row one. She didn't think they'd matter. She didn't think they'd say anything. She didn't think they belonged in the column of people who could get you fired. But she didn't realize the bigger truth until now. They didn't need to be powerful to deserve decency. They just needed to be there. And she'd failed them. Up in row 1, Darius glanced out the window as the wing lights blinked steadily. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply sat in the way he always had, anchored, composed. Celine leaned over slightly. Almost there. He nodded. Yeah. Malik tapped his foot against the base of his seat. Kaya was awake now, blinking the sleep from her eyes. Are we landing? She asked. Soon, Celine replied, brushing her daughter's hair back gently. You okay? Kaya paused. I don't know. Celine looked at her, patient and open. I didn't do anything wrong, Kaya said quietly. I know, sweetheart. But it still made me feel wrong. Celine nodded, her voice soft. That's what happens when someone doesn't see you clearly. It has nothing to do with who you are, and everything to do with who they've chosen to be. Kaya didn't answer, but she took her mother's hand. Back in the galley, Miranda stared at the floor, at the fine scuff marks in the metal, the same pattern she'd walked over flight after flight. Now it looked like a map of everywhere she'd been and didn't know how to return to. Farah glanced over, then away again. The silence was too loaded to break. Miranda opened her mouth to speak, but didn't. What was there to say? I'm sorry? I didn't mean it. None of those felt true anymore. She didn't even know what she meant, only that she hadn't looked twice at that family when they boarded, that she'd sized them up and moved on, and that the moment passed quickly, but its echo had been ringing louder ever since. The ding of the seatbelt light chimed overhead. Nina's voice came through the intercom, steady and smooth. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. Miranda stood slowly, moving through muscle memory, reaching to secure the last drawer in the galley. She didn't need to, but her hands needed something to do. As she sat back down and clicked in her harness, her eyes lifted just enough to see down the center aisle. Row 1 was still there, still calm, still quiet, still watching, even if they didn't turn their heads. She had once believed she was invisible in this role, that the passengers only saw the cart, the uniform, the surface. But now she knew. They saw everything. They always had. And as the wheels touched the tarmac with a soft bounce, Miranda felt the weight of something landing inside her too. Not punishment, not shame, but recognition. The kind that doesn't let you go back. The aircraft slowed gently on the runway, tires humming against the tarmac as the cabin tilted forward in unison. Passengers sat still for a moment, the kind of stillness that always came right after landing, before the rush, before the calls, before the bags. Just quiet, contained, waiting. Miranda sat strapped into the rear jump seat, arms folded tightly across her chest, her gaze unfocused. The lights of the terminal glowed faintly through the small windows, smudged by dusk and descent. In her lap, the edges of the official envelope curled slightly, creased now from where her thumbs had pressed into it over and over during the flight. She could feel her own heartbeat, steady but heavy, not like nerves. No, this was different. It was the feeling of something finished. The intercom dinged again. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Francisco International Airport. Local time is 6:42 p.m. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off. On behalf of your Altair crew, thank you for flying with us. Miranda didn't even hear the words as they were meant. She only heard the rhythm, the cadence she'd spoken herself countless times before. But this time, it wasn't her voice, and it never would be again. The seatbelt light blinked off with a chime that seemed to echo too long. Passengers began shifting, clicking their buckles, standing, reaching for overhead bins. That familiar chaos of arrival played out all around her, but Miranda didn't move. She couldn't. She felt like a stone in a river. At the front of the plane, Darius stood. His movements were calm, purposeful. He helped Kaya with her backpack, handed Malik his sketchbook, then turned to check on Celine. She straightened her scarf with a quiet poise that somehow carried more presence than anyone else in the cabin. They didn't rush. They didn't fumble. They just moved together. Passengers nearby parted slightly, as if without instruction. A subtle awareness hung in the air, like everyone understood that something important had happened, even if they didn't have the words for it yet. As Darius stepped into the aisle, Nina approached with careful steps. "Mr. Langford," she said softly, "Operations Control asked me to let you know they'll meet you at the gate, private entrance." He nodded, not surprised. "Thank you," he said. "You handled things with professionalism." Nina hesitated for just a moment. "I only did what felt right." He gave her a small, appreciative glance. "That's not as common as you'd think." She stepped back, allowing him to pass, her face a mix of relief and quiet respect. Celine followed behind him, Kaya tucked under one arm, Malik just a step behind. None of them looked back. They didn't need to. Miranda watched them from her seat as they moved through the aisle, slow, deliberate, silent. When Kaya reached row 6, she turned her head slightly, just enough to see Miranda sitting at the very back. Their eyes met for the briefest second. Kaya didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just looked at her, calm, curious, maybe even a little sad. And then she turned away. That was what did it. Not the message, not the envelope, not the badge surrender or the suspension notice. That look, that quiet, wordless recognition from a child who had asked for nothing but a drink of water and been told without words that she didn't matter enough to receive it. That look stayed with Miranda long after the Langfords stepped through the aircraft door. Passengers continued filing out. Some glanced at her, some didn't. One or two held their gaze for half a second too long. People who knew. People who'd seen just enough to fill in the blanks. And now she was the blank they filled. The last man off the plane, an older gentleman in a gray windbreaker, stopped briefly near her seat. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her like he was trying to place her. Then he said quietly, "I've flown this airline for 20 years. She nodded, unsure what response he wanted. He looked down at her hands, then back at her face. "Never seen someone removed mid-flight." Miranda didn't speak. He shook his head slowly. "Just goes to show. You never know who you're looking at." And then he stepped off the plane. That was the last straw holding her together. She sat there unable to move, her hands gripping the sides of the jump seat. Her whole body felt heavy, like the air around her was pressing down instead of lifting up. Farah stepped into the galley quietly. "They're ready for you." Miranda didn't ask who they were. She already knew. She stood, legs stiff, blood pooling awkwardly in her feet. The walk up the aisle felt endless. Every seat she passed felt like a mirror. She reached the door. Outside, 2 uniformed staff from Altair's HR office waited. One held a tablet. The other carried a navy blue document pouch. Beside them, a tall man in a black jacket stood silently. Security. No handcuffs. No drama. Just presence. "Ms. Huxley?" the woman with the tablet asked. Miranda nodded. "This way, please." No one shouted. No one scolded. But somehow that silence was louder than anything she could have imagined. And as she stepped onto the jet bridge, not as a crew member, not as a leader, not even as a name, they walked beside her, but not with her. Never with her again. The jet bridge was cooler than the plane, sterile and humming with fluorescent lights. Each step Miranda took echoed slightly off the metal floor, sharp and clinical. Like walking down a hallway in a hospital, except no one was coming to fix anything. To her right, the HR rep with the tablet walked in silence, eyes focused on the screen like this was just another task in her shift. The man in the black jacket didn't say a word, but his presence was a wall, not threatening, just final. No one said where they were taking her, but she knew. It wasn't the gate where passengers streamed out. It wasn't baggage claim. It wasn't even the employee exit she used every day. They led her down a side corridor, gray walls, locked doors, no windows. A route she'd only seen once before, years ago when another crew member had been quietly removed after showing up to a flight intoxicated. That memory came back now, vivid and uninvited. A heavy door with no sign above it opened with a soft click. Inside was a small debriefing room, 2 chairs, a metal table, a cabinet with a printer on top, humming quietly. One wall held a mirror she knew was two-way. The air smelled like coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The HR woman gestured to a chair. "You can have a seat." Miranda sat slowly, her legs stiff from hours of stillness. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers intertwined. She didn't ask any questions. What was there to ask? The woman sat across from her and set the tablet down. We've reviewed the submitted reports, the in-flight observation logs, and the footage provided by 2 passengers and 1 crew member, she said, her voice professional but not cold. The executive office has escalated the incident to a formal conduct review. Miranda nodded once. No argument, no denial. Her mouth was too dry to form anything more than that. You will be suspended effective immediately pending final decision, the woman continued. Your badge access has been revoked. Your uniform and crew materials are to be surrendered before you leave this facility. She slid a folded paper across the table. Miranda opened it slowly. It was all there in clean language. No blame, no emotion, just consequences. Her career reduced to bullet points. The woman's tone softened, just slightly. You have the right to respond in writing if you wish. Your union rep will be notified. But I want to be clear, this is not disciplinary review in the usual sense. This came from the top. Miranda's throat tightened. She managed a hoarse, "The top?" The HR rep nodded. Mr. Langford's office. It landed like a whisper she'd been trying not to hear all day. There it was. Confirmation. Darius Langford hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't demanded retribution. He hadn't even looked angry. But he had spoken. And when a man like him speaks, the walls move. You're not being escorted out because of policy, the woman said more gently now. You're here because of perception, of judgment, of something that goes deeper than a missed drink. Miranda looked up. I didn't yell. I didn't insult them. I didn't do anything. But that's just it, the woman replied. You didn't have to. You made a choice without even knowing you were making one. Miranda didn't argue. She couldn't, because in her gut, she knew it was true. The door opened and Farah stepped in, holding a garment bag and a small box. She looked apologetic, her eyes heavy, her hands careful. They asked me to bring these, she said, setting the bag on the chair beside Miranda. Inside was Miranda's change of clothes. Jeans, a navy turtleneck, comfortable shoes, the kind of outfit she wore when traveling as a non-rev. Now it was all she had. She took the bag and stood slowly, moving to the small changing area behind a curtain. She removed her blazer, blouse, and slacks with quiet, robotic movements. Each piece folded as if she were still trying to impress someone, though she no longer knew who that might be. She unpinned her wings last, held them in her palm for a long moment. They weren't heavy, just metal and plastic. But they felt like 1,000 things all at once. Pride, routine, identity, and now, shame. She placed them gently in the box. When she emerged, the HR woman nodded once. We'll email you the final review decision within 5 business days. If you'd like to file a statement, you have until end of day Friday. Miranda didn't reply. The woman stood and held out a manila envelope. Final paycheck confirmation, severance eligibility notice, instructions for ID return. Miranda took it. That was the last exchange. The man in the black jacket opened the door again. No cuffs, no raised voices, just the end. They walked back out into a corridor she'd never noticed before, one used for maintenance staff and private personnel. It emptied into a quiet corner of the arrivals level, far from the terminal crowds. Outside the sliding doors, the night air was colder than she expected. She clutched the envelope to her chest, unsure where to go. Taxis pulled in and out. People reunited with loved ones. Children laughed. Phones rang. Life moved on, unbothered. And Miranda stood still in the middle of it all, a name no longer attached to a job, a gate, or a plane. Just a name, one that now meant something entirely different. She stepped onto the curb, looked up at the terminal lights one more time, and let herself feel the full weight of what silence can cost. The taxi line stretched out under the glow of overhead lamps, casting long, uneven shadows on the pavement. Miranda stood off to the side, her garment bag slung over one shoulder, the manila envelope still clutched tightly in her hand. She didn't feel cold exactly, but the wind caught at the edges of her sleeves like it was reminding her. She wasn't part of what was inside anymore. She opened her rideshare app, but her thumb hovered over the screen for a long moment. Where was she even going? Home. What did home mean now? The apartment where her airline-issued luggage still sat by the door? The living room where framed crew photos lined the walls? That space didn't feel like hers anymore. Not in the way it used to. Her phone buzzed. She looked down expecting another automated message from HR, but it wasn't that. It was a number she didn't recognize. Just 3 words. Sometimes silence echoes. DL. She froze. Her eyes scanned the message again, but the initials said enough. Darius Langford. No warning. No threat. Just a sentence. It landed with more weight than any formal letter ever could. She didn't know whether it was meant as a closing line or a mirror held up to her choices. But either way, it stuck. She lowered the phone slowly. Around her, the airport buzzed with late-night travelers. Families laughed. Couples bickered softly. Suitcases rumbled along the sidewalk. All of it moved past her like a river around a stone. She spotted Nina coming through the sliding doors, now out of uniform, pulling her small suitcase behind her. She wore sneakers and a zip-up hoodie, her hair pulled down and relaxed. Their eyes met. Nina gave a small nod. Not cruel, not dismissive, but not warm either. Just acknowledgement. Miranda wanted to say something, anything. But what do you say to someone who just witnessed the unraveling of your entire identity? Nina walked past, never breaking pace. That was the second cut. Not angry words, not condemnation, just absence. Miranda finally moved toward the curb. A black car pulled up, her name flashing on the back seat screen. She climbed in without a word, placing the envelope gently on her lap. The driver asked where she was headed. She gave her address, but her voice sounded unfamiliar in her own mouth. The car pulled away, merging into traffic. The terminal grew smaller in the rearview mirror. She thought about everything she'd built, every red eye she volunteered for, every holiday she'd spent 30,000 feet in the air, every moment she'd believed she was part of something bigger than herself. And yet none of that had protected her from the truth she'd been unwilling to see. Not once in all those years had she stopped to think that fairness wasn't just about being equal to everyone. It was about recognizing when equal wasn't enough. That sometimes dignity had to be given louder, not quieter, to people who'd spent their lives being overlooked. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't cursed. She hadn't broken protocol. But she'd failed. She'd failed when she assumed that a man sitting quietly in first class with his family didn't deserve the same warmth she gave others, without question. And she failed again when she didn't realize her silence had been louder than any insult could ever be. She reached for her phone again and scrolled to her contacts. Dozens of familiar names blurred past. Fellow flight attendants, scheduling supervisors, a senior pilot she used to joke with on long hauls. She clicked on one, Erica, her old roommate from training, and hovered over the call button, then stopped. What was she going to say? I think I lost everything over a bottle of water? Number, that wasn't it. She lost everything the moment she decided someone had to prove they belonged before she treated them with respect. That was the real loss. And the truth of it? That was going to follow her long after the paperwork was filed. Outside, the lights of the Bay Area blurred past. Somewhere above her, another Altair flight was preparing for descent. A different crew, a different passenger list. The world hadn't stopped. But for Miranda Huxley, it had changed. And now all that remained was what came next, and whether she'd have the courage to look that silence in the eye and finally learn something from it. By the time Miranda's car reached her apartment complex in Daly City, the sky had settled into that deep blue-gray stretch between dusk and night, where streetlights blink on like reluctant confessions. She stepped out of the car slowly, the manila envelope still pressed tightly against her chest, like it could anchor her in a world she no longer belonged to. The driver didn't speak. He didn't have to. She wasn't the same woman who climbed into his car 30 minutes ago. Upstairs, the apartment greeted her with the familiar scent of lavender cleaner and silence. It was clean, too clean, like no one had really lived in it, only passed through between flights, layovers, and 4 a.m. alarms. The blinking light on her landline was the only sign of life. She dropped the envelope on the kitchen counter and pressed the voicemail button. A robotic voice announced, You have 2 new messages. Beep. Miranda, it's Shelley from crew scheduling. Uh, just checking in. I heard something, but I didn't want to assume anything. If you need to talk or if there's anything I can do, call me. Beep. Ms. Huxley, this is Daniel Ortega with the union office. We were contacted by HR regarding a possible conduct review. If you'd like representation, let us know by noon tomorrow. We can't intervene unless you formally request it. She deleted both messages. They didn't sound like help. They sounded like cleanup. She walked to the living room window and stared out at the parking lot. 2 teenagers were skateboarding in the far corner, laughing too loudly for a Tuesday night. A dog barked from a neighboring unit. The world, as always, moved on. Miranda reached for her crew-issued duffel bag and unzipped it. Inside, a pair of backup stockings, a wrapped granola bar, her service pin, and the emergency whistle she'd never used. She held it in her palm, then dropped it into the trash without thinking. There were no emergencies left to signal. Then, without really knowing why, she pulled out her phone again and searched his name. Darius Langford. The screen filled with headlines. The quiet billionaire behind Altair Airways. How Darius Langford built a fleet without seeking the spotlight. A man of few words and big moves. She clicked one article and read, he believes in leading without spectacle, in letting his people speak for him. But those who know him say the most powerful thing he carries isn't his wallet, it's his silence. She swallowed hard. That was the silence she'd dismissed on the plane. Not passive, not weak, just waiting. For people to show her who they were, and she had. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, tempted to send an email. Something short, something formal. But then she closed the tab. He didn't need her apology. He already had the truth. The next morning, the official notification came through. Final decision. Termination confirmed. No appeal. Conduct violation upheld. Effective immediately. Attached was a digital copy of the incident report. It didn't list what she said. It listed what she didn't. No racial slur, no insult, no raised voice. Just failure to extend standard service. Repeated neglect. Breach of Altair's Dignity First Protocol. At the bottom it was signed, Darius Langford, founder and executive chairman, Altair Aviation Holdings. There was no flourish, no comment, just his signature. That was how a man like him ended things. With precision, with calm, with permanence. She stared at the screen for a long time, then stood, walked to her closet, and pulled down the framed certificate from her first year of service. It had once meant everything. Now it felt like a souvenir from a life that had belonged to someone else. She slid it into the trash bag with the rest of her old uniform and zipped it closed. Then she sat at her kitchen table, hands resting on the bare wood, and whispered into the silence, I saw him. I just didn't see him. And in that moment, more than at any other time in her life, she understood what it meant to be visible and what it meant to disappear. At gate B-23, things had already shifted, even before the next crew boarded. Flight attendants leaned in closer when the name Langford came up in conversation. Supervisors lowered their voices. There were whispers of emails from corporate, new reminders about the Dignity First Protocol, and a sudden rush of quiet compliance that wasn't fear-based, more like reverence or guilt. Everyone had heard the story. Even if they hadn't been on Flight 2087, they knew what had happened. The story spread faster than turbulence at 30,000 feet. Not through official reports, but through glances, side comments, and those hushed words between gate changes. It was about water, they said. No, it wasn't about water. It was how she acted. The founder was on board, his family. She didn't know, but she didn't care either. Inside the crew lounge, 2 younger flight attendants sat cross-legged by a row of vending machines, scrolling through the internal chat app. The thread was quiet now, but a few screenshots remained, captured text logs, a cropped image of Miranda's removed badge form, and a fuzzy shot of her walking the jet bridge with her head down. I thought she was one of the sharp ones, one of them said. She was, the other replied, until she wasn't. At the same time across town, Darius Langford sat quietly at the long wooden table in his home office. Sunlight poured in from a narrow window behind him, painting soft lines across a desk cluttered with papers, flight maps, and a worn leather folder labeled Founder's Notes. He hadn't spoken about the incident to anyone publicly. He didn't need to. He'd already taken action, and for a man like Darius, action was speech. Celine walked in, holding a warm mug of chamomile. "She called," she said gently. Darius looked up. "Miranda?" Celine nodded. "Left a voicemail. Didn't ask for anything. Just said she understood." Darius exhaled. Not relief, not satisfaction. Something quieter. He turned back to the open folder in front of him. Inside, a photo of a much younger version of himself, boarding the first Altair test flight, a rented turboprop with peeling seats and mismatched carpet. He remembered that day more than the day the company went public. He remembered the way the agent looked at him when he said he was a passenger in row 2A, the way they triple-checked his boarding pass, the way they asked to see ID again after he had already passed security. That memory never left him. It was stitched into the seams of everything he built. Celine placed the mug next to his hand, then sat beside him. "You think she really learned something?" she asked. Darius didn't answer right away. He stared down at the photo, then at the edge of the mug. Finally, he said, "I think she's starting to." He stood and walked to the window, watching the tree branches sway outside. "I never wanted to humiliate her, just make sure she heard the silence she gave us." Celine joined him, arms crossed loosely. She heard it. It just took a while to settle in. Back at the airport, Nina sat alone in the quiet part of the break room. She replayed the flight in her mind. Not just the final hours, but the beginning. The little moments. How Miranda had looked when they first prepped the cabin. Confident, crisp, unshakable. And then how she unraveled, not from what anyone said, but from the realization that she'd missed something so deeply human, it couldn't be filed under service delay or passenger behavior. It had been a mirror, and that mirror had cracked wide open in front of all of them. Nina picked up her phone and wrote a short note in her private journal app. "Sometimes you don't need to scream to be cruel. Sometimes ignoring someone kindly is worse than shouting, because it tells them they aren't even worth a reaction." She hit save, closed the app, and stood up. Outside, passengers lined up for a new flight. Children clutched backpacks. Couples argued quietly over snacks. It was all the same on the surface. But something had changed, not in the airline, in the people watching. And sometimes that's where the real shift begins. 3 days after her termination, Miranda sat on a park bench across from the Altair terminal at SFO. She hadn't planned on coming back, not this soon, not ever really. But something about the view across the street, the quiet procession of rolling suitcases and uniformed staff moving through sliding glass doors, it grounded her. She looked different now. No blazer, no badge. Just a navy sweater and jeans, her hair tied back in a loose knot. A paper cup of black coffee sat untouched beside her. She'd bought it out of habit, not need. From here, she could see gate B23 if she leaned forward a little. The same gate where her last flight had landed. The same gate where it had all ended. A young flight attendant exited the terminal with a bright pink suitcase and a bounce in her step. She looked barely out of training, full of nerves, full of pride. Miranda watched her disappear into the parking lot with a strange kind of ache in her chest. Not jealousy, not quite regret either. Just distance. The kind of space that opens up when you realize you're no longer part of something you once gave your whole self to. Her phone buzzed. A message from Farah. "Hey, I don't know if this is okay to say, but I hope you're all right. I still remember the way you helped me when I almost missed my first jump seat check. I don't forget that. I also don't forget what I saw last week, but I know we're more than our worst moment. I hope you're finding your way." Miranda stared at the message, her thumb hovering above the keyboard. She didn't know what to reply. Gratitude? Apology? Silence? In the end, she just typed, "Thank you for seeing me, even when I didn't see you." She hit send, then locked her phone. Behind her, a group of tourists argued over a rideshare pickup zone. A toddler cried. A man dropped his boarding pass and chased it in the wind. All the noise of airport life, loud, messy, familiar, filled the air like a song she used to know by heart. And then another sound. Laughter, warm, software, familiar. She turned slightly. Across the street, emerging from a private car, Darius Langford stood by the curb, one hand resting on the open door. Celine stepped out beside him. The kids, Kaya and Malik, followed, suitcases in tow. They didn't see her, and she didn't move. She just watched. They walked together into the terminal, unhurried, graceful. The world moved around them but didn't intrude. Miranda held her breath without meaning to. A woman in security blue stepped toward them, not to question, to greet. She shook Darius's hand, then took their boarding passes and led them toward the express lane. No delays, no doubt. That's what recognition looks like. Miranda sat back, the bench creaking softly beneath her. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had once stood between them and a glass of water, a gesture so simple it should have passed unnoticed. But in her silence, she'd said everything that mattered. And now, in their silence, they were saying it back. Not with spite, not with gloating, just with presence. And presence, she had learned, can be louder than punishment. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small notepad. She hadn't written anything in weeks, but now her hand moved without resistance. At the top of the page, she wrote, "The seat I never saw." Then below it, it was never about first class. It was about the space between respect and assumption. A space I used to fill with policy. Now I fill it with awareness. She sat with that sentence for a long time, letting it settle, letting it reshape the way she saw herself. And then she closed the notebook, stood up, and walked away from the terminal. Not because she had somewhere to be, but because, for the first time in a long time, she knew who she didn't want to be anymore. The lobby of the Altair Human Resources building wasn't nearly as cold as Miranda expected. Muted gray walls, soft lighting, a row of plants that didn't look real but were cared for like they were. The receptionist offered her a polite nod when she walked in. Not cold, not warm, just neutral. Miranda gave her name quietly. "Have a seat," the receptionist said. "He'll be out shortly." Miranda sat in the farthest corner of the waiting area, her back straight, her hands gripping the same folder she'd carried since she left the airport. Not because there was anything new inside, just because she didn't know where else to put her hands anymore. This wasn't a reinstatement meeting. She knew that. There was no job offer waiting, no reversal of what had happened. But when the union rep had called and told her that someone from Langford's executive office had requested a final sit-down, not with legal, not with HR, but directly, she said yes before thinking it through. She just wanted to face whatever was left to face. The door opened quietly, and there he was, Darius Langford. No entourage, no assistant, just him. He wore a gray suit, no tie, and an expression that didn't offer judgment, but didn't offer safety either. "Ms. Huxley," he said, stepping forward, "would you join me in the conference room?" She nodded once and followed him. The room was small, just a table, 2 chairs, a carafe of water in the center. He gestured for her to sit. Then he sat across from her. No paperwork, no tablets, just him. "I won't take much of your time," he said. Miranda leaned forward, trying to steady her voice. "I know I can't change what happened," she said. "I'm not here to ask for that." Darius listened, silent. I wanted to understand," she continued. "I've spent every day since trying to name what I missed, and I keep coming back to this." She touched her chest lightly. "This reflex I didn't know I had. The kind that made me treat you and your family like you didn't belong. Not loudly, not obviously, just enough to make it felt." He looked at her, not moving, but engaged. "I didn't think you'd notice," she added. "But of course you did." There was a pause. Then he spoke, slowly, evenly. "You're not the first person to underestimate my family. You won't be the last." His tone wasn't cruel. It was honest. "But what stood out wasn't what you said," he continued. "It was what you didn't, the way you made us invisible. That kind of harm, it doesn't show up on flight logs, but my daughter will remember it." Miranda's throat tightened. "I know. You weren't the worst person I've ever met on a plane, Ms. Huxley," he said, "but you were a mirror, and we all saw what you reflected that day." She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. I saw it too, eventually. He nodded once. That's why I asked for this meeting, he said. Not to undo anything, but because sometimes people deserve a second moment. Not a second chance, necessarily, but a second moment. To understand what the first one cost. Miranda blinked quickly, her eyes burning. She didn't let the tears fall. Not here. Thank you, she said. He stood. The conversation was over. It didn't need more. She followed him to the door. Before she left, she turned. Your daughter, she looked at me before she got off the plane, Miranda said quietly. She didn't look angry. She just looked disappointed. And that, more than anything, has stayed with me. Darius nodded. She sees people clearly, even when they don't see her. Then he opened the door for her. Miranda stepped into the hallway and walked out into the bright afternoon. This time her steps didn't feel heavy, just honest. The light outside had shifted again, softer now. That golden hour glow casting long, warm shadows across the sidewalk outside the Altair HR building. Miranda stood still for a moment on the front steps, letting the air settle on her skin like a quiet apology. No one followed her out. No one needed to. That final meeting hadn't been a doorway. It was a mirror, just like Darius had said, and sometimes looking in the mirror didn't bring closure. It brought clarity, and clarity was its own kind of mercy, even if it didn't erase the past. She started walking, not fast, not aimless, just forward. She didn't head toward the parking lot or the train station. Instead, she walked toward the public viewing deck above the airport's main terminal. One of those places people forget exist unless they have time to kill or a child who loves airplanes. When she reached it, she leaned against the glass. Below her, runways stretched out in perfect symmetry. Jets taxied in silence, their bellies glinting with sunset. Crews in neon vests moved like ants, small but essential. Life went on. She watched a plane lift off, then another. It hit her all over again, not as loss, but as a memory. How many takeoffs had she stood through? Not as a passenger, but as part of it. Not watching from behind glass, but guiding nervous flyers, calming crying babies, securing carts with muscle memory honed over years. That was a different lifetime now, and yet it was still hers. Even if she no longer wore the wings, even if her name would never appear on a schedule again, even if she'd never board another plane as crew, she had still been part of it, and that mattered. She pulled a small notebook from her bag, the one she'd started scribbling in after everything, the one that had slowly shifted from bitterness to something closer to truth. She flipped to the last page and wrote, "Some flights don't return you to where you started. Some show you who you've become along the way. And if you're paying attention, even a hard landing can change how you fly next time." She closed the notebook. Her reflection in the glass looked softer now. Worn, yes, but not broken. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the Altair wings she'd thought she'd thrown away. Turns out she couldn't do it. Not yet. She didn't pin them back on. She just held them for a while. And then gently, she left them on the ledge by the window, next to a sticker some child had pressed to the glass. A smiling sun faded from months of sunlight. She didn't need the wings anymore. She had the lesson, and that would fly further than any jet ever could. As she walked back down toward the street, her phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. There's a position opening up at a nonprofit that trains flight crew in empathy and cultural awareness. They're looking for someone with field experience, someone who's learned the hard way. You crossed a line, Miranda, but it's what you do next that writes the rest. S.L. Celine Langford. Miranda stopped walking, then smiled, just barely. And for the first time in days, she turned off airplane mode. Not on her phone, in her heart. She was ready for whatever came next. And maybe that's the quiet truth this story leaves us with. Sometimes the deepest harm isn't in what we say, but in what we choose not to see. Respect isn't something you offer based on status or appearance. It's something you owe every single person, in every seat, every time. What about you? Have you ever witnessed a moment where silence spoke louder than words? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. And if this one moved you, don't forget to subscribe. There are more powerful, true-to-life stories coming your way. Stories that remind us that dignity should never depend on recognition.